Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, the former president of Peru, the foreign minister of Sudan, and the only Grand Slam winning tennis player to have beaten both Nadal and Federer in the same contest. But we begin with the continuing turmoil in the Middle East and Africa. This week has seen the departure of Yemen's president, more deaths in Syria, a renewed assault from Colonel Gaddafi's troops in Libya, and Israeli gunfire on protesters on the Golan Heights. It's all very, very confusing. But where is it going? Where next? Who better to ask than the former British Prime Minister, the Quartet envoy to the Middle East, Tony Blair. Tony, welcome.
Thank you, David.
Very good to have you with us. Do you think, in fact, this whole thing, the Arab Spring and the revolts and the revolutions, in the end will prove to be a good thing for the stability of the region or not?
I think long term, definitely good in terms of the march towards democracy and freedom and the ability of people to elect their own governments. Short term, it's really challenging, and it's going to pose a lot of problems both for the countries and for the outside world. And I think what's important, therefore, is to recognise that this isn't just about political reform. There's got to be economic change and social reform as well. And insofar as the outside world can play a part, it's to try and support people who are of a modern mind and a democratic will to try and put their country in shape to be part of the future. And
what at the moment is the effect going to be on Israel of the Arab Spring?
Well, I think the immediate effect on both the Israelis and the Palestinians is instead of points of stability and predictability around them, they've now got a lot of instability and unpredictability. So I think for Israel, their security concerns are if anything, heightened. And for the Palestinians, their worries about what will happen, will they get statehood, are even more pronounced. And although some people say because of these internal issues, it's going to be very difficult to make progress, I think it's precisely now at this moment that it's all the more urgent that we set out a framework for resolving this issue and for achieving a secure state of Israel and a viable and independent state of Palestine.
But what tangibly would have to be the first step?
I think,
to see, because it's been very elusive, any sign of progress just lately, hasn't it?
It certainly has been. There's no doubt about that. However, I think the best thing we could possibly do right now is to set out a framework that allows us to move this thing forward, that, if you like, contains within it the principles upon which we could base a credible negotiation. Because that's the key thing in the end. You've got to get the parties back to the negotiating table.
And that alone is quite a problem, obviously.
Well, it's going to be difficult unless the Palestinians think the negotiation is going to be credible. And it's going to be difficult, obviously, unless Israel goes into the negotiation realising that there's a real prospect that it can succeed.
And what do you feel about what's going on in terms of the situation of the sudden unity of Hamas and Fatah? Some of them complain that the Israelis said that they weren't going to negotiate with two. Now they've got one, and they won't negotiate with one.
Yeah, and what I'm saying to people is let's wait and see what actually emerges out of this, because if what comes out of it is something that's going to promote the concept of peace, then it could be positive. But the question is it? And I think there's obviously decisions for everyone here, decisions for Israel as to how it deals with it, the international community, how we deal with it, for Fatah and, of course, for Hamas as well. Because one major issue out of this will be, is Hamas prepared to say, right, let's, we're going to pursue our objectives peacefully, we'll get into this negotiation, we want a proper state of Palestine, we want to be part of this.
Yeah, and I mean, do you see Hamas becoming acceptable to the community of the world over a shortish period?
The single thing that Hamas should understand most is that actually people want them in this. They don't want them out. I mean, I know, having dealt with this now for 4 years, it is far easier to make peace if they're part of this rather than excluded from it. Now, they would say, well, bring us in. And my point is that in order to get people into a peace process, you need at least to agree some basic ground rules. And the single most important thing is that they say, look, from now on, we'll pursue our objectives peacefully. Right? Now, obviously, it's not just them that got to do that. Everyone's got to do that in a situation like this. But unless they're prepared to make that commitment, it's hard to see how they can play a constructive role. On the other hand, if they were prepared to make that commitment, then I think the door would be open.
And in fact, there are those who say, quite influential people who say that actually, in fact, within Hamas there is more of a yen to be part of this process than you would expect.
And it's obvious for them to do that, because the Palestinian people, the one thing that's clear is that they want this issue resolved. They want it resolved fairly. They want a state that is the West Bank and Gaza, East Jerusalem. They want to be part of a political process that is going to lead to a viable Palestinian state. And despite what everyone always says about the impasse and the obstacles and so on, there's no alternative but to carrying on. And actually, some of the things the Palestinians have done in these past few years, President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad, building the institutions of statehood, getting the militia off the street, putting in proper security. The economy actually on the West Bank has been growing quite strongly. Gaza still huge problems, but even in the last few months, there's probably been a trebling the amount of stuff going into Gaza. There's so much more we could do if we could get the right framework in which you could have a healthy and a credible negotiation.
And in terms of the rest of the area, the Middle East, as we look at it, which countries do you think have most to fear at the moment? I mean, in terms of ongoing rebellions, revolts leading to...
I think there's a very simple thing going on, which is that in today's world, particularly with the nature of the new social media, the way people communicate with each other, there is a general yearning and desire, not just for political change in the sense of being able to elect your government, but a desire for systems that have predictable rules, where you've got the rule of law, where you've got anti-corruption. People want those types of societies, and believe it or not, people are no different in the Arab world than they are anywhere else. Now, I think that where countries and governments are setting out a process of steady evolution and change, we should be backing that. In my view, evolution is preferable to revolution in these circumstances, because the trouble with revolutions are never where they begin, but where they end. But it's very hard in circumstances, for example, in Libya, where there appears to be no prospect of evolution, people then go for revolution.
Why, you mentioned different countries there, why in fact is it that people are puzzled why we seem to have done, the West seems to have done, or the Allies seem to have done, less against what Syria is doing than against what Libya is doing?
Yeah, and I always say to people, this is a perfectly fair point. You could analyse both situations with sort of pure logic and say, well, surely the two are the same. I think there are differences. For one thing, frankly, there isn't the appetite for intervention in Syria in the same way. Secondly, I think people...
Why isn't there appetite?
Because I think people recognise that Syria, the dangers of instability there are very acute. It's got an impact probably of a more direct nature on the region. Obviously, it joins Israel, so there's got all sorts of implications there. So I think people are cautious for that reason. I think the other thing is that over the years, and I've had my own very well publicised differences with President Assad in Syria, there was a hope that he might prove to be a reformer, that he might show a path to steady change in his country. Now, I think the time's running out for that. I hope he could still do that. If he did, by the way, I think even now people would want to give that a chance. But, you can't have a situation where, people come out on the street to protest for change and they're doing it peacefully, and then they end up getting subject to a pretty brutal repression.
Yeah. What about this quote, Tony? Israel's Prime Minister may even decide to bomb Iran's nuclear plants to deflect attention from what Defence Minister Barak has called the tsunami in September. That seems a last day before midnight sort of threat.
I think that's one of these conspiracy theories that does the rounds in the region I spend a lot of time in, rather too much. Look, Israel's got a very clear position on an Iranian nuclear bomb. And by the way, the international community has as well. It's not a good idea. They shouldn't do it. But I don't know of any plans to take military action. And in any event, I don't think this issue to do with September and recognition or otherwise of a Palestinian state, I think those are two completely separate questions.
And what about, do you think it's a good idea what the Palestinians want to do in terms of going for recognition to the UN?
Well, I think
do you support that or not?
I'm the Quartet representative, and I represent
on the one hand, you think this, but
well,
on the other
but I represent 4 different institutions, each of which I think is a separate and different position on this. So what I would say is this, and I think this is where most people would agree. The preferable thing is to get a negotiated settlement, because in the end that's the only thing that delivers a Palestinian state. I mean, even if you get a resolution at the UN, the day after, then what? You know, it doesn't deliver you a state. So I think my preference is get people back to a negotiation around a framework of principles that give us a really clear idea that such a negotiation will land with a fair result.
Do you think Libya is looking more positive at the moment or not?
I mean, I think, but you can never be sure of these things, that it's a matter of time now. And then we've got to put a lot of attention towards what comes next, how Libyan people get the chance to have a constitution that gives them a decent chance to elect their own government. I think there will be a lot in the whole of the region, by the way, Egypt particularly. I really single Egypt out in this regard. How we rebuild the economy and reconstruct the economies of the region. How we make sure, for example, that people understand it's not just about the freedom to vote. It's about freedom of expression. It's actually about freedom of religion. I mean, I'm very worried about some of the things happening, you know, in terms of oppression of minorities and persecution of people in the region. You know, freedom is not just about the freedom to vote in and out your government. It's a whole attitude of mind that's about a society that is pluralistic, that is democratic, that is tolerant.
Exactly, and those have all got to come together in the future. Do you think that both sides, both parties are well stacked with people for negotiations if they take place?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you go back. The interesting thing to me is when you go back over the last 15 years or so and you see all the different proposals for peace, I mean, they come back to the same basic issues. And they aren't hugely divergent from one another. So at some point, we're going to have to create the ingenuity that allows us to get back and have a negotiation that's sensible and productive.
And what about Libya at the moment? As you think back to those moments, and the pictures were joyously replayed of you hugging Mr. Gaddafi and so on and so forth. But do you think there will be a resolution that leaves Gaddafi out of the picture? And
yes,
that could
I think
happen
so.
without further war?
Well, I hope it happens as quickly as possible. You know, look, my attitude is very simple. When he did the right thing, giving up his nuclear and chemical weapons program, when he started to cooperate in the fight against terrorism rather than sponsor it, we were right to welcome it. When he starts killing his own people without mercy, you've got to condemn it and act against it. So I hope we get change there and we get it reasonably quickly.
Where in the world is the most dangerous section? We'll come back to the Middle East again in a moment. But where gives you concern in the rest of the world at the moment?
I think in the rest of the world, I think there's one basic question. I mean, I don't think the 21st century will be a battle about fundamental political ideology, but I think it could easily be a fundamental battle about religious or cultural ideology. And I still think this question of how you bring people of different faiths and cultures together, living together, working together, understanding each other is the biggest challenge. And
one thing that, just like old times, it comes back again, and it came back again in the British papers and so on, the great subject of your relationship with Gordon Brown and so on and so forth, back in all the headlines again. I was reminded of someone who said, I always think of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown as like Cain and Abel, brothers, but in a different sort of way to what you'd expect. That was for Old Testament lovers. But but in fact, when you saw that, did you think again, oh, I wish I'd done something different in 2005, or does it just pass you by now? What reaction did you get from all those headlines?
It just passes me by now. I mean, to be honest, I've kind of moved on from it, and I'm very busy with what I'm doing now, and in a way, I don't think it's either productive or sensible, really, to look back. So, you know, I literally, you asked me, do you focus on it? Do you let it pass you by, and I let it pass me by.
You let it pass you by. A very shrewd move. And what do you really want to do in the next few years? There's this great subject we've been discussing today, but what else do you want to achieve in the many years ahead?
I think the interesting thing when you're out of office is you can focus on limited things. So I really focus on three things now. One is the Middle East peace process, obviously. The second is this concept of religious interfaith and bringing different people of different cultures together and religions and faiths together. I think this is the big question of our time. And the third thing is I do work in Africa. You know, we when I was Prime Minister of the UK, we trebled aid to Africa. We put Africa on the agenda. We now work with governments in Africa to promote better governance and building capacity. And, you know, it's a hugely... those two last things are both big charities that I now run and really enjoy doing. And I do some work in climate change and even sport. So...
Sport's the one that sometimes turns out to be more difficult in terms of finding peace than even some of the others.
Quite so.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, David.
It's a delight. It's always a delight.
Thank you.
Thank you. In March, Peru's Nobel Prize-winning novelist Mario Vargas Llosa compared a hypothetical presidential runoff between Ollanta Humala and Keiko Fujimori to a choice between AIDS and terminal cancer. After a first round that split the centrist vote, Peruvians did go to the polls again on Sunday to choose between Mr. Humala, a former army officer promoting a leftist brand of Andean nationalism, and Ms. Fujimori, whose claim to the job rested on the fact that her father was Peru's controversial president for most of the 1990s. Reluctantly, Mr. Vargas Llosa, along with a narrow majority of his fellow citizens, decided Mr. Humala was the better candidate. Well, joining me now, so we can find out more, joining me now from Lima, Peru, is former Peruvian president and a man who also stood in this election, President Toledo, Alejandro Toledo. Welcome to the programme. Before the first round of this vote, everybody picked on you as the favourite to win. But just towards the time of the first vote, you didn't win and you didn't qualify for one of the two people in the runoff. Why was there that change? Was it luck, judgment? Why did your leadership not win you the race?
We were 10 points ahead on the lead in the first round. And unfortunately, there was a Machiavellic move made by President Alan Garcia, today's president. And he wanted to go into the second round. Mrs. Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of the imprisoned President Alberto Fujimori. And so he put someone else and stole the votes, literally. And so we were not able to make the second round. And so and then they end up Mr. Humala and Keiko Fujimori. We were the favorites, but something happened in the first round that Mr. Garcia, who is governing in complicity with Fujimori, wanted the daughter of Fujimori to go into the second round, and that's why we were not in the second round.
So he was responsible for that, Alan Garcia, the president?
Absolutely.
And why did, when it came to it and you had to decide who to vote for in the second, since you couldn't vote for yourself because you weren't in the second round, why did you choose to back Mr. Humala rather than Ms. Fujimori?
Because I was the leader of the Democratic Coalition to bring down corrupt government during the 90s. Alberto Fujimori, who escaped from Peru to Japan, and we discovered that he has a Japanese nationality, that he was not a Peruvian. He resigned by fax from Tokyo, and it was really a movie of Hitchcock, of political surrealism, and to the extent that I was the leader who mobilized the people to bring him down, and we discovered later on that it was a government with a very deep corruption and with violation of human rights, it was impossible for my party and for myself personally to vote for Fujimori's daughter again. And so, unfortunately, Peru was caught into an undeserved dilemma of choosing between Ollanta Humala and Keiko Fujimori. Ultimately, we chose the lesser of the evils, and I decided to support Ollanta Humala, but with the conditions that we will be a very rigorous, vigilant of the democratic values, the freedom of the press, the human rights, the rule of law, and not to truncate the economic growth in which the country has been the last 10 years, growing at 8 or 9% for 10 consecutive years. Now, there is always a risk, but we have endorsed the candidacy of Humala under the principle that we will adopt a very severe, vigilant role in order for him not to go into the Hugo Chavez's line of policies in Latin America.
Are you confident that Mr. Humala will not be tempted to come into action with policies that sound as though they're the policies of Mr. Chavez in Venezuela?
Well, let me tell you, we have put a straightforward conditions because there is the rumors that he has some association with Chavez. I have spoke straightforward with him that we will support and we will provide help to start his government. But if he, by any reason, goes on the direction of the Hugo Chavez's policies, we are not only will oppose his government, but we will go out to the streets once again to recuperate, to strengthen democratic institutions, to defend the freedom of the press, human rights, and to stimulate economic growth. So he knows what the conditions are, and we will not allow it. We will not allow any inclinations towards the Hugo Chavez's policies.
That's very clear, thank you. That's very clear indeed. You've been in great form, and thank you very much, and we look forward to talking again very soon. Thank you very much. Former President Toledo there. We're going to stay, though, with South America right now after the break, because we've got the young tennis star from Argentina, Juan Martín del Potro. You may remember his great triumph 2 years ago against Roger Federer. We're going to find out what the future, after a bad injury, what it holds for him after this break.